Welcome to the ClassCast Podcast, where philosophy, policy, pedagogy, and people come together in honest, purposeful conversations about improving school and education for our students and our communities. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens, an award-winning English teacher, speaker, tutor, and podcast host in Northern Virginia. You can listen and subscribe to the ClassCast Podcast on all major streaming services, on YouTube, and at ClassCastPodcast.com. Ladies and gentlemen, class is in session. Welcome to the ClassCast Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens. Today, we'll be speaking with Al Kingsley, the CEO of NetSupport Group. He is not only a guy with lots of tech knowledge and experience, but he's the author of a new book called My Secret Edtech Diary. He's also written 100 plus articles on technology and proper applications. And given all the work we've done in the last couple of years using educational technology, some by choice and some by force, it seems like not only a good time to publish a book on it, but maybe a good time for us all to be thinking very carefully and purposefully about what tools we have, what tools we should be using, and maybe what school's going to look like moving forward, hopefully, fingers crossed, post-pandemic, because all the growth we've made using EdTech hopefully doesn't disappear, right? Hopefully some of this carries forward and we know what we're doing. So Al, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk today. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks. My pleasure to be here. Looking forward to a good chat.
Yeah, so with the book, what sort of prompted the writing? Just sort of curious about, obviously the timing works, but aside from the pandemic, what else sort of made this project come to fruition for you?
Well, I guess the lighthearted response would be, I've reached an age where if I don't put it to paper soon, I'm going to start forgetting the important bits. Right. But like many things we've seen the last 18 months, there's been a catalyst where lots of the topics that many within the education space have been talking about or trying to get talked about over the last 25 years have suddenly had a bit of a catalyst and a kick up the backside, and we've suddenly seen it come to the forefront. And so, like all these things, what you don't want to do is take short-term views and decisions about how you best incorporate and utilize technology within the education space. It's always better to kind of pause, reflect, have a look back, reflect on what's happened, what we've done well, and move forward. So I kind of wanted to wrap that in with a bigger part, which is a real passion of mine, which is to try and remove the myth that it's just the realm of the techies. And so broaden that narrative that actually it doesn't matter where you are on that technical competence journey, the conversation about what I need to do, what I'd like to be able to do within the classroom or within the bigger school context, the questions you need to ask so that you're better able to join the debate and discussion. So really try and make that more accessible.
That's awesome. And you're right. I mean, it's an important time to pause and reflect. Sort of full disclosure for me, I've always I'm supportive of innovative measures, but I'm not an early adopter. Like I'm a guy, I like to let somebody else who wants to start something. I'm like, you do it for a year. Let me see how that goes. If it looks promising, I try it. I also have a rule where I try to only use 1 or 2 new tech tools per year, for the simple reason that when you do too many things too fast, you start to mess them up. And when it comes time to reflect or look back at your data, there are too many variables. It's too confusing. So if I only do 1 or maybe 2 new things each year, I give myself a chance to actually do it well. I also can then look at the end of the year and say, how did it go? And I know that I'm looking at, the influence of those new things. How do you recommend people handle that? Especially, I don't know, this might be an impossible question, but especially coming out of a pandemic where so many people use so many new tools, like how are we supposed to be reflecting right now?
Oh, Ryan, you are a man after my own heart. I'm so glad you said that because, ironically, I talk a lot about building and developing a digital strategy, bringing voices together, and then how best to take that forward. And of course, one of the key strands is, ironically, for somebody promoting the adoption of EdTech is less is more, and very much the sense that you need to have that sense of doing some things well, getting them embedded, deciding and having means of measuring impact, because it does 2 things. Firstly, you achieve stuff, which, let's be honest, is pretty good. But secondly, it also builds confidence in taking the next step and the next step. If you get those wins and you can actually measure it. So you're absolutely right. Doing too many things at once rarely is a successful process. So that's kind of one strand that I kind of very often talk about, is about that measured approach. I think there are lots of things that kind of feed into that conversation. So one of the most important things is we talk about what we're going to adopt, but actually often the thing that's the real catalyst to success is both the comms of bringing stakeholders together to actually implement change. And the thing that seems to always be top of the list that's forgotten is the PD around it. We invest in the tools and we invest in the software, but sometimes the budget in terms of time and investment in the development and the support to make sure we get the most out of the solutions gets somewhat missed. So I think that's one side. There has been a real plus, I think, over the last 18 months, and there haven't been many, let's be honest, which is, it's something I've talked about a lot recently, which is about we've actually been given a bit of a green light to take risks, not in the biggest sense, but in the smaller sense that educators have been, through necessity, frankly, have kind of reached out and tried more things than perhaps their natural persuasion would be, because they've needed to look at different solutions and ways to engage with their learners. And through taking risks, of course, you have successes and failures, but it does also accelerate that willingness and reception to think, actually, there's other stuff that we could try. And look, we've actually got some things we can actually embrace now as being successful. So I think it's about finding that right pace. The ultimate thing, whenever we talk about, planning a digital strategy, and it's no different in the commercial world than the education space, is always about starting with why you're doing it. What's the point? What are you hoping to achieve by it? The shiny because it's shiny is never going to fly as part of a long-term plan. But the idea of, look, we've sat down, we've identified what our priorities are. These are the pinch points. These are the things that we'd like to try and drive forward in terms of our engagement, our teaching and learning, our comms, whatever it might be. Then having that as the driver to look at the key solutions, I think, is a much more effective model to scale.
Yeah, and that raises a lot of questions about adoption of new tech, or say signing a new contract with a new vendor at a district or a division level. Because there's a big part of this that I feel like as a classroom teacher, as a classroom teacher who likes to think above my pay grade, I try to keep my mouth shut when I'm at work above my pay grade. But I think about how we get into these situations where all of a sudden, new school year, and we have 5 new digital tools that we're all supposed to use. I think, who thought that was a good idea? And usually what happens is it's 5 different people, had a budget and decided and did this thing. But I think sometimes there's limited input from classroom teachers, or the input that is there are from classroom teachers who already used it. Sometimes someone in a supervisory role says, hey, I heard of this great new tool, or maybe a teacher asks them, hey, I found it, can we get this? But then I think sometimes there's a little bit of an echo chamber there, where the people who are all in the room and deciding, hey, do we sign this contract? They're also the people who already do like it. And so sometimes there are things that classroom teachers want that the administration doesn't get, or the administration gets it, but no one asked for it, and who's going to say no to a new tool unless someone says you have to use a new tool that you didn't ask for? How does some of this sort of shake out in terms of the adoption process? And
it's really,
should this be like top down, bottom up? Like what's the right way to make those calls?
Well, I suppose, and lots of the points there you make really resonate with me. I mean, the thing I always start by saying is no 2 schools are the same. No 2 cohorts of children are the same. And that applies just the same from the teaching cohort. And I'm not a fan of the prescriptive model that this one size approach will magically fit for every class across a school or district. And we saw that actually because some of the quickest adopters in terms of mitigating the challenges with COVID and moving to an online or a blended learning provision were in the UAE, the large cohort of international schools. Partly they were frontline in terms of the rising cases, but more importantly, they were really well funded in terms of IT, so better able to do that flex. And they very quickly learn, and there's lots of good evidence and research around it, that the model of let's just replicate the school day and we're all going to use exactly the same tools in the same way didn't exactly work. And the reason it doesn't work is from the exact model that you're talking about. There are layers, going into the onion, like from Shrek kind of narrative here. There are layers to school Edtech. So there are things that you need commonality of, that movement of student data, centralized reporting and certain key systems. But then there's also things that happen from a classroom practice point of view, where I think you have to trust the teacher to know what works best for their cohort of students. And you can't assume that every member of staff in your school is at the same part of their own digital skills journey. Some will be much more confident and wanting to try and endeavor new things. And if we're looking bigger picture, and it's always about balance, but if we're looking bigger picture about moving innovation in our school or district, we've got to make sure that we don't level ourselves down to the lowest common denominator, rather than actually empower those that have an appetite and an ability to actually help drive through fresh ideas and bring those to the table. So much as I think it's never a black and white answer, and you can't have a purely central approach and you can't have a purely local approach, the smart money is, before you make those decisions, is you get all the stakeholders around the table and you find where the strengths and weaknesses are, what things are non-negotiable because we need it for successful district operation, and what things where actually we've got flexibility. Because we have to remember as well that often the most senior leaders in our schools, by the nature of their experience and time in the profession, may not necessarily always have the best first-hand reference point about how effectively EdTech impacted in their own lessons. So it's one of those scenarios where we actually want to empower some of our, less experienced teachers who have come to the profession, perhaps have got broader digital skills or experiences from other districts. And we want to make sure that we're looking through, as I refer to in my book, the widest possible lens.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. You said a couple things in there that I actually have talked about several times on this podcast, and that last piece, who's making the decisions and what is their frame of reference. I think in most situations, and it varies, school division to school division, but I think usually there should be a few more teachers in the room. And I think that there should always be more students in the room, because in the end, they're really the client. We treat this all like the teachers, the principals, or whatever. But in the end, it doesn't matter how well or poorly the teachers figure it out. It matters how well the students do. And there are plenty of situations where I've seen it, where the teacher kind of knows how to use the tool, but the kids figure it out. In the end, as long as they know what they're doing, the learning's going to happen, right? That's the real function of it. And so I wish that we had more students involved in those adoption and selection processes. Not that we necessarily need to let them, go out and find the technology on their own in the first place, but I think that they should be an important part of the adoption. Something else you mentioned in there is sort of this idea of differentiation between teachers, which is kind of a big, I don't know, I hate the term pet peeve, but it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, just that not only do we sometimes adopt technology for a whole district-wide sort of situation, but then when we do the training, and as you said, sometimes it's great and sometimes it's terrible. And, I have the good fortune of working in a relatively large school division in a relatively affluent area. And so, when we get a new piece of software, we get training on it. We get training on it to the point where I don't want to go to the training anymore. Give me an hour alone and I will figure it out. But with that training piece, there isn't a lot of differentiation between the teachers, which is kind of ironic, because in most cases with good ed tech, one of the best things about adopting good technologies, it helps you to differentiate the learning for your students.
Absolutely.
And then we do the professional development for the teachers, and we treat everyone in the room like they equally don't know what's going on. I'm not the most tech savvy person, but in most cases, if you just gave me an hour and let me play with it by myself, a little sandbox, I'll be fine. Or I'll come back with the questions that I need. And I have coworkers who it would take them, a year to get in the same place, and they need a different kind of training. We tend not to do that. And so when you're thinking maybe more from the tech side about how do we present the technology, how do we get these tools really working, is there a way we can improve that professional development side of it? Like, can companies reasonably do that? Or is that going to be something that's, a constraint on budgets?
I think actually the truth of it is there isn't a choice. Vendors have to, from that point of view. And I think it's fundamental because, when we think of the narrative, and a lot of the points there again that really resonate with me, we do lots of things in the classroom with our learners, and then somehow when we're doing professional development for our staff, we seem to forget some of those rules and go back to the one size fits all, which absolutely is very ironic. But if you think about that point about, schools taking risks and trying more solutions, one of the things that we've really got as a takeaway, I think, over the last 18 months is now there's an appetite, and we've got more kit in schools, and we've got more of an opportunity to embed and utilize EdTech. We've also got an obligation on vendors to actually provide the evidence on two levels. Firstly, the kind of the research-informed evidence and backing about, you can't just say this product's amazing. Use this product and all your learners will suddenly magically raise their levels of attainment. And the second thing is, I think we've finally moved away from the here's a brochure, my name's Al, would you like to buy some software? Thank you very much, goodbye. We're actually now much more about vendor customer relationships, often about co-production, the evolution of the products to be, on point with what's happening in a very fast moving landscape within schools. And as part of that, I think the only way schools and products are successful with technology is if the vendors take an ownership themselves, that they also need to be delivering some of the professional development around the most effective use of their tools. It should become more of a relationship rather than that single transaction kind of basis. And I think we are seeing more of that, with the delivery platforms of different solutions now, there's more of an opportunity. In the same way as we've been saying for the last 18 months, everything doesn't have to be synchronous. You can do asynchronous. You can record exemplars and videos, and you can make those resources available to learners at different times of day. Well, hello. Shouldn't we as vendors be following the same rule when it comes to providing training content and best practice for the use of our products for our staff and students? Doesn't the same rules apply? So I think, again, I think it's really important that, we're all lifelong learners, and I don't think that line in the sand between the educators and the vendors and the techies needs to exist. I think we all follow the same rule, which is if it's good for one, it's good for the other. We need to actually learn what's worked best and actually share that best practice. So I think there's absolutely a shift in the power battle. Power battle is perhaps a bit of a harsh term, but who's in charge? Because it's not just about what's the price. The conversation much more now is about actually the right reason. I think educators are becoming much more informed about what they want, and that conversation about what they're trying to measure and how they're going to get outputs. And in doing so, it empowers for more challenge beforehand, before I spend my time. And that's the most valuable commodity, frankly, in trialing and investigating this product. Give me more substance, give me more evidence as to how this is going to benefit me. Tell me about how you're going to look after us. How are we going to develop our staff to be kind of confident in the use of this so we can embed it and it'll have long-term value. And I think that's healthy. That's the way it works in many sectors, and education should be no different. And I always flip back to money's a given. It's always a challenge. But actually time's the real commodity here, about how do we save time selecting products, getting up to speed on products to get the most impact out of them. And of course, ideally, as well as impacting teaching and learning, how do they help save time? Because I would argue, the more that tech can do to support, be that facilitator, certainly within the classroom setting, then the more time the human being at front of class has got to do what they do best with their young learners, and that's where we want to be empowering it.
Yeah, time is always the issue. That's what I always say about, every challenge I face in my job and my personal life is that, more money would be nice, but more time would be better. that would really make this a lot easier. And I'm thinking about what you're saying in terms of that feedback loop, and how a good technology vendor should be trying to improve is you're receiving the feedback, you're responding to it. And I've had the good fortune of working with some companies and some technology in my classroom that, generally works well, but when it doesn't, or there's an error, there's something, I send an email, and less than 24 hours later, I have an actual human being responding to me with a solution or a question. And, and I know they're taking note of it, because you can check back 2 weeks later and that same issue has disappeared for everyone. Right. I've also worked with companies, and I, personal experience, it's anecdotal, but on average, I think they're bigger companies tend not to be quite as responsive, and maybe maybe they feel like they don't need to be, or, I don't know, but that does make it a little bit tricky. But, you're right. There's a lot of ways to do this. And sometimes just by providing that asynchronous opportunity to say, hey, teachers can learn this on their own, or if you have a professional development session, here's a library of videos, play around with it, and we have an expert in the room to help you out. When you started talking about that, I thought about, when the pandemic was sort of first declared, March 2020. And it was like our second day off school. And I have a friend who's an executive with Canvas, learning management. And so he and I talked, and I recorded that episode. Like, I didn't even know what to ask him yet. I was just like, I know everybody's going to have these questions, so let's see what we can do. And he had some really cool ideas about just general, what we can do with the technology and all these options. And I don't know, 2 weeks later, recorded an episode just myself talking about, like, we have nothing to lose. I was just set on this, like, look, we have nothing to lose. We could try all these cool new things, and we'll see what works and what doesn't. And we get back to school, and whether that's the fall or, the year after, whatever it is, like, we're going to have all of this. And I got the distinct impression, not just where I work, but in most places, that there was this huge and very strong drive to get back to normal, right? It was get back to normal. And as you pointed out, like, you don't have to replicate your regular school day with bells and the timing and all that and do it online. And unfortunately, I think that's what most places did. Most places that went online have done something along those lines. And I've now taken a job. My school division has launched a new virtual school next year. So I will be the one of the first teachers in an all online 100% virtual school. But we are still doing, like, the regular school day, the bell schedule, everything else. We don't have a lot of guidelines, at least so far, on what that actually entails or what's going to be required. And, so I've like got to sort of roll it slowly, but I have big ideas for the ways that we can do some of that flipped classroom and all the ways we could do. It sounds funny to say blended learning when you're already online, but the sky's the limit. And I think that there were a lot of opportunities squandered over the last year because everybody was just so worried about trying to get back to normal. And now it's like we're almost there. We're so close. And like, okay, fine now, but a year ago, year and a half ago, that was the time to get weird. If we wanted to do this, we should have. Do you feel like this is a huge generalization, so I don't know how you want to respond, but do you feel like school divisions took advantage of those opportunities somewhat, or was a lot of this maybe a missed opportunity to really innovate or try to implement this new technology?
I think the real challenge on this is, back to my philosophy of no two schools are alike. I think it's really tough when you try and generalize too much. I think clearly there are some that embrace the opportunity more, some that were slower off the mark. And sometimes that might have been justified by different pressures and circumstances, staff pressure and other variables, of course, as well. I think where I try and always look in terms of the kind of lessons learned, be reflective, always consider and look back on is, much as there's been all these challenges, there is now an opportunity ahead of us, but there's also a big kind of asterisk and caveat sitting next to it, which is, I think there's a risk that many want to get back to the way we used to do things. And in doing so, run a risk of losing some of those skills and tools that they've acquired confidence in over the last 18 months. And for everything that we've tried and said, well, maybe that doesn't work, there are other things we've learned that actually moving forward can shape and change the landscape of the way that we interact and engage with our learners. Some of the tools might be more about inspirational than about academic, but I'm cool with that. It's all about experiences as well and how we engage learners, but some will be about how we can, in parallel to that human aspect, whether it's, personalized learning pathways and other aspects. So I think, yes, absolutely. Some were better than others. Some teachers were better than others. Maybe better is a wrong word. Took different paths and priorities because, it may have been, perfectly appropriate for some teachers with their cohort to do things differently. I was really interested in your point about your new role, as well as being chair of a multi-academy trust here in the UK, so very much like a school district, a cluster of schools. I'm also chair of an academy, a school which is an alternative provision. So basically provision of education for young people that struggle in mainstream education, typically behavioral, social, emotional challenges. And if you take young people that have their own distinct needs and struggle in mainstream education, and you flip back to the conversation we were having earlier and say, right, so you're going to sit in front of a Teams or a Zoom session for 6 hours and listen to teacher. Well, actually 15 minutes is an achievement. 20 minutes is an achievement. Actually, pre-pandemic, getting them to come into school was part of the challenge. So again, thinking of that way, it's kind of like, what are we hoping to achieve by trying to mirror this very inflexible model? Surely everything we try to achieve is shaped by, as you said, when it came to shaping the tools we use, shaped by what's best, what resonates most with our learners, what will get them to the table and actually inspire or get their attention and hopefully help them in their learning journey. And so I think what we've hopefully learned and what I want to see taken forward is not a black and white rule book, but the fact that there are more choices, there's greater flexibility, and we shouldn't be scared of being more flexible where it's appropriate. Surely ultimately the measure is, do our learners engage more? Do they acquire more knowledge? And the thing that I'm very passionate about also, skills, their own critical thinking, their own way of assessing and chasing and finding more information. And I think the skills part is the bit that runs the risk of being lost in our journey towards just knowledge-based facts, shall we say.
Yeah. And as you pointed out, there's so many variables here, right? The differences between the students, the differences between the teachers, between the schools, between the communities that they're serving. It really makes it difficult to prescribe, a solution, because what works in one place won't necessarily work in somewhere else, or somewhere else. But like you said, all of this, we need to sort of keep our eye on the prize, so to speak, and say, focus on what is it we're trying to accomplish for these young people. And so maybe it's a good time to ask one of the big questions of this podcast, which is, in your mind, and I'm gonna give you both halves of the question. For some guests, I pick one or the other, but I think you can decide how you want to respond. I always ask people, what is the purpose of education? And then sometimes, what is the purpose of school? Because depending on where you're coming from, they may not look like the same thing. But if we're supposed to reflect on our experiences using educational technology, you can't do anything to evaluate, the function of something if you don't know what the purpose was in the first place. So to you, what is it we're trying to do in our schools?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those questions where we could go down all sorts of different pathways and probably have a 5-hour conversation, I suppose. Trying to encapsulate it, I sometimes find is quite a difficult one. I probably hinted a little bit where my bias and focus is from the last question, which is, fundamentally, what is an education about? It's to equip young people to have the right knowledge and skills, with a bit of a underline over the latter part of that question, to empower them to make whatever choices they want in the rest of their lives, to give them the tools to follow whatever pathway, to be a positive contribution to the world, but to be happy and motivated, and have those tools. And that's a bit of a woolly answer, but I suppose I really struggle sometimes to separate, well, what is it I think of for my children who have now grown up? We empower them with information and skills to handle challenge more effectively, to find out how to inquire, to find out more, to build their resilience, to build their passion and enthusiasm to engage in activities and hobbies and follow their dreams. And it's very rare I talk to an educator that isn't trying to replicate the same thing, which is to be there and give a chance that a child that lift, that boost, to say, whatever you want to do, there's no ceilings here, there's no aspirational limit. We want to give you the tools to go away and do that. Where I start to wobble a little bit, because of course wearing my chair of a trust hat is, obviously we're often measured in our league tables based on that pure academic performance. But the thing that really resonates with me, and I think tech sometimes does play a role, is about the experiential side of what we're at school for. I think back to my time in school, and often the things that really resonate with me in a really positive sense are the relationships, the teachers that stand out, that put, that nurture, an arm over your shoulder when you needed it, the school trips, the events, the activities, the things that you kind of take away with you along with your friendships. And I'm always really conscious that as we move forward, and the world is a very different place in terms of the way within business we now communicate and work. We're digital, we're virtual, we're face-to-face, we're traveling. The world is now interconnected. In that same way, I kind of think that's where the tech bit has that positive role to play in terms of the education experience. I've got youngsters in some of our schools as young as 5 and 6 with their VR headsets looking at the Amazon rainforest, and that's a catalyst to go away and do some creative writing, some very simple writing, but it's a way of actually getting them excited, and the imagination, the catalyst for that. And so, that for me is very much where I think education on one level, if I follow a very formalized approach, it should be a leveling of the playing field, giving every child an equal opportunity to do all those things that I've prefaced already about giving them those tools to go off and be amazing,
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, that was a great answer. And there's a lot in there. Like you said, that probably could be its own 5-hour conversation, but and by the way, your answer is very similar to mine, because if you don't show me the kid or the group of kids, I say, what do you want for everybody? And I say, I want to empower individuals and uplift communities. But that means a different thing to each individual in each community, right? It's kind of a good non-answer, but you can't really be more specific until you see specifically who you are working with. The experience piece is important, and something that actually surprised me when I was doing the interview for the virtual school job that I just took, that'll be starting soon, was I rolled into it thinking, like, I'm a good teacher, I've got a great resume, this will be fine, but I'm not real fancy when it comes to using the ed tech. Like, I'm happy to use things, but like we said, I'm sort of slow on the 1 or 2 things a year and make sure it's working and all this. And I thought there's a real chance they're going to hire people who are using a lot of fancier things than I am, who, may or may not be getting good results, but that's it. Almost all the questions were about relationships. Almost all the questions were, how did you get to know your students this year? How did you get them involved? What did they do? What did the students think was fun? And they had a couple of questions about ed tech stuff. And at that point, I'd almost forgotten about it. And I ended up spouting off about how, if we can get this program up and running in the next couple of years, I'd like to write a grant to get VR headsets for our kids, because like, that's really, I think, where a lot of this is going to go. I say in the long term, it may only be a few years away, but that was the whole interview, was basically, how do you get students to engage and to have that relationship? Because, and I think it's smart, because in the end, that human connection to your teacher, to your classmates, things like that, that's really what provides a lot of motivation. Some kids are intrinsically motivated, or they're motivated by a relationship with their parents. But for many students, it's how you feel about the people around you, how you feel about the room you're in, that really has a lot to do with what those outcomes are going to look like. And depending on what technology we're talking about, sometimes that can help, and sometimes maybe that could even hurt if we're either not implementing well, or if that's, causing students to work maybe more independently than they're ready for. When you think about that relationship piece, which you talked about and I just brought up, a lot of that really has, I think, to do that in sort of detail, has a lot to do with how we as the adults feel about school. Like how I feel about school dictates how I behave, and how I behave dictates what my students are going to do in response. And so I always think, it's always important to be honest with people about our own backgrounds. And so I talk to students about, this is how I did in school, this is how I liked, this is what I didn't like. So, and sometimes they're smart about it. They'll be like, oh, hey, we noticed we haven't been doing a lot of blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, well, and they go, it's because you don't like it, right? I'm like, well, yes. And it's good that you know that too, because that means we're on the same page. We have this relationship, and means we can be honest about our goals. For you, thinking about your role in school leadership and in technology leadership, how did you get there? Like, what was your education like that set you on a career path that led to, and I might be wrong, my interpretation looking at, some information about you is there's sort of this like dual path of this focus on technology, and then somewhere, and I don't know when it happened, but all of a sudden education starts to play a really big role in it. What was your education like, and how did it lead to the career you've had?
I think that was a very polite way of saying it's a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde owl when it comes to my pathways. And you're probably absolutely right. The truth is, I have very fond memories of my educational experience. I was in a position, and I think in many regards I class fortunately, in other regards I class as unfortunately, and that might be a shock to some, to kind of start your narrative about your education experience with a positive and negative term. I went to boarding school. I was both a day boy, so at an independent school that went home in the evenings, and also had a period where I stayed at school. In the UK, boarding schools are quite popular, and that was one of the pathways I went. I had what I consistently feel was a really good education. I learned about myself, independence, confidence, interpersonal skills, communication skills, and other aspects. But I also felt there was perhaps a price to pay in terms of family cohesion, the amount of time I actually spent with my parents and home. My education was a 6.5 days a week education during term time. So in many ways, I know I'm not dismissive of it, because I got a good education, and I'm very fortunate that I got some of those skills and experiences. But at the same time, it also shaped my view with my own children, that I wanted them to have the same opportunities in terms of quality of education and choices, but at the same time, I wanted to be there. I wanted to follow the journey hand in hand the whole way through, and so as part of that process, like all these things, you either share an opinion, or you roll your sleeves up and you get involved. And so my way of rolling my sleeves up and get involved was to say, look, I've got lots of skills and experiences. Well, I certainly had a few at that point, and we're talking probably 20 years ago. But I would also like to get involved and support both the development of new schools where I live, and bring that experience to the table, as well as learn, because you can't critique something. It's very easy to pick as an expert from the outside, but if you don't actually been involved, we've seen that on social media way too much the last 18 years. Everyone's an armchair educator.
Everybody.
So I became chair of a standalone school in my home city, Peterborough, here in the UK. And then we changed our status to be an academy. We bid for funding, and we opened a new secondary school. And then we built another primary school, and then another primary school, and another school joined us. And we've gradually evolved in terms of those schools. And with my experience supporting school leadership, I was then asked to support other schools and districts. And so my experience kind of grew from there. And all the way along, I think the thing there's actually a lot in education that's like technology. In technology, it's very fast moving, and you're often looking to find the benefits, find the things that you can do differently to your competition, and then wrap them up and keep them as your trade secret. That's your competitive advantage. And then you move into the education space, and the first thing you learn is when you do something well, you share it with your peers. It's a kind of a counter argument, but it's really refreshing. And I love the fact that in education, people are so both supportive and the most important word I often refer to is so reflective. I think sometimes it's a strength of character to be able to be self-critical. Some people see it as a weakness. I see it as a huge strength in character to be able to go back and reflect. So what I've found is the two are very symbiotic. I'm in a very fortunate position where I can be spending time, good half of my time in schools, and I see challenges. And rather than just show a bit of empathy, I can offer solutions, but I can also say, I don't know a solution. I'm going to go away and make one. And I've got an amazing team at NetSupport where I can say, hey, I've got this great idea for a product. Let's see if we can deliver something. Let's co-produce it with some schools. Might take a couple of years to get it right, but at the end of it, I guess the measure is we've been going just over 30 years as an EdTech vendor. So, we've started to get a few things right as well as a few things wrong along that journey. But again, I think if we hadn't made all the mistakes, as every business does, if you don't learn from your lessons, then you're never actually going to be successful, and I've often kind of used the thing. I was having a conversation a couple of weeks ago, and I always kind of said, failures are stepping stones to success. And I think that's the way you have to embrace it and look at it in terms of that journey. So, I have fond memories of my education. I mean, I was a strong average, I think, is a good academic assessment of my ability. But I think it's about what do we measure that average on? That's me measured on a piece of paper that says how well I did at my end of year exams. I think everybody brings lots of different strengths to the table. And as an employer, I should say it quietly, because if many of my team at our schools heard me, they'd be saying I'm setting a bad example for our students. I rarely look at the exam certificates. I look at the people. I look at their appetite, their enthusiasm, and how engaged they are. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't want a neurosurgeon to have been recruited on the basis of purely their attitude. I'd like to think there'd be some paperwork behind it as well. Right. But in many industries, it is about, it is about the human dynamic, the people, who's going in your team, what skills have people got the potential to learn, not just what they already know. And so, from that point of view, I think there's all sorts of pathways we can pull across, because in education, it doesn't stop at a certain age. We're lifelong learners. It's always connecting those pathways to the next step and the next opportunity.
Yeah. And man, it's a tough one to sell people on sometimes, though, that sort of the blend of what you'd said before about the experiential sort of nature of education versus how do we actually assess what's working. So today, this morning, this episode won't come out for a few more weeks, but the morning that we recorded this, College Board released the AP exam scores, and I taught 3 AP classes, and I was like, all right, well, I knew the date just because they sent an email. Otherwise, I probably would have forgotten and checked in a week. But I was really excited to see them, mostly because we just had this weird year and we're online and all the rest. And my wife was like, so does this tell you how the year went? And I said, no, because I do a survey with my students at the end of every year. In fact, when I'm really on the ball, I do one at semester break and at the end of the year. This year, I forgot the first one, but I give them an anonymous survey and says, what did you like? What didn't you like? What did you learn from? What didn't you learn from? And then they give me feedback. How did I do? They get to grade me and say, what should I do more of, less of, do differently, et cetera. And then once school ends, I read them all. I always tell them I won't read it until the grades are all done. So you don't have to feel like I'm, going to penalize you or something. That's really all the information I need is what did they like? What didn't they like? What do they think they learned from? What didn't they learn from? Yeah, I read all the essays. I saw that. But when the scores came out today, I got to be honest, I was more excited to see them in any year since the first time I taught the class, because now I'm like, I need something concrete and measurable, because they told me how things went online. neither they nor I have ever done this online before, right? So like when you say, oh, I think you did a great job, well, great compared to what? No one had a comparison point. So now I can take, sort of the qualifiable information that they gave me and I can put it next to something quantifiable. I really do think there needs to be a blend of that. And I know it's popular for teachers to say, get rid of or reduce standardized testing. I would like to reduce a little bit, but man, I don't want to get rid of it just because I think you do need a way to measure it. Say when you're running your company, getting feedback from your clients or hearing, how your employees think things are going is great. But in the end, we also need to look at a balance sheet. Like we're a company, we need to make money,
Yeah.
And as a school, hey, if all the kids are happy, the parents are happy, all that's great. But as you keep saying, that skills piece needs to stay in focus. And that means at some point we need to have a hard measurement of those skills. And so while I may not love every test that my students take, I do appreciate having some concrete data to say, does the data bear out what I think just happened in the room in front of me? And it's really important. And it's especially important when you're trying something new. So whether that's a year of a pandemic and you're all online, or maybe it's a quote unquote normal school year, but you're using some new tools, your enjoyment of it is not the whole picture. We got to look at what those results are. When we think about the reflecting on EdTech, and I'll loop in the title of the book again, just because maybe this is appropriate to it, but the book's titled My Secret EdTech Diary. And if you think about it, a diary is something that you write as a personal reflection. You write it for yourself, right? So, anytime someone publishes a diary, no offense, but I'm always a little suspicious because normally these are things that we write not to be shared, but that's that place for reflection, right? So at what point in the reflection process or do we have to figure out a balance between the experience and the happiness factor versus the hard outcomes of the data or the learning or the profits or whatever that may be? How do you approach that as we hit that reflection point? And also, did I misrepresent the book with the diary? I apologize.
No, you were spot on there. And many people have pointed out that certainly choosing the word secret was a very short-term part of my title because I failed spectacularly already on that. And just to clarify, the reason why I called it a diary, and it isn't a case of this morning I woke up, had coffee, and then decided to make this bit of software. I called it a diary because I think the point about EdTech is it's about everyone's different, that personalized approach. And it is absolutely much more about lots of different views from and voices from education and sharing best practice and guidance. But what I didn't want was a handbook, because the handbook kind of implies you're supposed to do this.
Right.
And it's not about you're supposed to do this. It's about here's lots of things you can consider. Here's questions you can ask. Now pick the ones that are relevant to you. And that's why I wanted to steer clear from it being perceived as some kind of reference book, which I think would be very presumptuous on my part. In terms of that other question, you talk about that balance, and you're absolutely right. Everything in life is about balance. We can take a really simplistic view about, well, those ultimate assessed grades are the things that open doors on our careers, and the skills are the things that allow us to flourish and develop successfully within those careers. And it is about balance. Here in the UK this year, we had what were referred to as TAGs, teacher assessed grades. So all the assessment was done in school. Exam boards weren't part of the process. And everyone, or many people said, oh, we should move to that pure teacher assessment throughout the process. That's great unless you're a teacher and you say, well, hang on a second, I've just now acquired another piece of work that's on my shoulders every year that the exam boards used to do, and no one's paying me extra for it. But you're right, actually, in most schools, one of the things we always try and do is, as well as our own trusting our teachers, is you want that peer assessment, that benchmarking to make sure your assessments are in line and you're making similar formative assessments. So actually, I think having some form of external measure is really important. I think the balance really is how much weighting do we put to that end of year or end of academic cycle exams that we put at the end, and how much balance do we put to that assessment that's gone on during the journey. And again, I've just always felt that we used to have many subjects in the UK which were, large part of the ultimate exam outcome of your qualification was based on the assessment, and the end of period exams counted for 30, 40, 50%. And actually now a lot of the exams, it's purely just that endpoint and nothing more. And I think we've perhaps lost something in the fact that I think there's a better blend. There could be more assessment. I think it levels the playing field, particularly for youngsters that can be really successful in their journey over 2 or 3 years, working with a subject and acquiring knowledge and skills, but actually just don't perform well under pressure in those fixed 2-3 hour tests at the end of the process. And we want to make sure that every child's given the best opportunity to shine. For some, it's a case of, if we could just do it on a keyboard instead of a pencil and pen, I might be more successful. And right. Whilst that's a skill you've got to acquire, again, I would sit there and say, well, if we roll the clock forward 10 years, Ryan, won't we be doing this, talking into Siri, our exam answers? And we'll be doing it so we can talk with all the things we know. And what we're being assessed on is how much do we know, not how quickly can we get it down on a sheet of paper. The world and the way we measure things is changing. So I'm kind of with you. I think it's important to have that external validation and verification. It's about how much weighting we put onto it.
From the perspective, wearing your other hat as a technology CEO, where does that assessment piece sort of fit for you? Like it is, I think in a way it's accurate. I also think that a lot of times when people say this, they're not trying to provide accurate criticism. I think people are just being cynical, but they say, testing is about money. And on one side it is. Someone got paid to make the test. Someone gets paid to norm these things. And then if you're going to provide technology solutions that help students gain these skills, obviously we're a company, we're trying to make a profit. But I think that sometimes that's a dishonest criticism, because I think that in most cases, at least in my experience, most of the educational technology companies or people working for those companies that I know genuinely care about kids learning, right? But we can't forget that part of this is a company piece as well. When you think about educational technology from the perspective of the tech firm, not from the classroom, what's the balance there? I mean, we need to make money. Or how often are we willing to give up a little bit of money for a little bit of increased, say, student enjoyment or whatever else? And I'm sure that's different in every company. I'm not asking you to speak for everyone else, but how do you guide your employees through that math?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important question. And it's a hard one to unpick, because who am I to assess how others should or shouldn't? I think one of the key drivers, of course, is where you are on your journey as a business. If you're a small startup and you've just started developing a solution, then often money will be at the real pressure, the stress, the thing that you're trying to mitigate and develop so that you can break even and make modest profits early on. As you become more established, you get more of a sense of where you fit. You've got a sense of, from a fiscal point of view, of what your operational costs are, what you generate, what happens in different markets. I'm going to be quite controversial and say I often think you can split the market into those vendors that have been around in their current guise for many, many years, developing solutions, working in education. And you can split, and this is the point where if we were on a live phone in, we'd probably get the calls start coming in now about how very dare I. I'm often quite cynical about the businesses that are externally funded. And I say that not because they aren't, in many cases, a positive catalyst to the delivery of new technology. So I'll put that out there as a nice one. But in many, many organizations that are funded via that mechanism, there is a finite window of 3 or 5 years where that business needs to realize a return and it gets sold to new ownership. And that's how those that invest in that opportunity make their return. And I think sometimes that chasing the growth in the operational profitability of a business can outshine the actual bigger picture of, are we making a difference? And more importantly, are we here for the long run? And so where you see businesses that have kind of grown up and grown with the market, grown with the sector, and continue to do exactly that, you recognize that actually longevity doesn't come. It's not a gift that you keep just because you can make profit. It's something that you have to buy that respect, that you have to buy that custom and that business from the sector and prove yourself year on year on year. Because one thing increasingly we see now, particularly in the education space, but around the world in a connected sense, is in the same way as we can engage with educators very effectively through Twitter and other social media platforms, if you don't do what you promise to do, if your product doesn't deliver, people will hear about it just as quickly. And so you can fall as quick as you rise in terms of your engagement with your customer base. So I think if you're looking for longevity and long-term and being part of developing solutions, taking pride in what you achieve, and also the relationships that you have with individuals across the sector, that shapes that actually the conversation isn't specifically about how much profit. Of course, you need to make profit to be sustainable, but as a customer, if your business wasn't making profits, you probably wouldn't want to invest in their solutions. You want to make sure they're around for the next few years to deliver on what they've promised. But I think it's about finding that balance. It's more for me the short-term flip businesses that worry me more, that they're actually much more driven by the numbers, and that rarely shows in terms of the longer view in terms of how those products are going to evolve.
Right. I mean, and I think that is a very smart and fair answer to it, because company to company, all that's gonna change. And usually in these discussions, I don't name a specific company. For the next question, I'm going to, just because I think it's a unique situation. And near the end of this question, I don't know how I'm going to phrase this exactly, but if I start sounding like a conspiracy theorist, with a tin hat or whatever, just tell me to stop. But my school division has now adopted a new learning management system and all this kind of stuff. But for a while, they were big on the Google products and using Google Classroom. And, it's free to use publicly. It's cost efficient / free when you go to the institutional level. So you say, well, what's the profit motive there? And I keep telling people there's no such thing as a free lunch. And for me, this actually has less to do with its function. I think it works fine. It's not fancy, but it works fine. For me, this is a question of privacy, because with any new piece of technology, particularly in a school setting, we need to be very conscious of the data that is collected and how that is going to be used or possibly disseminated. We should always do that for everyone, but especially when we're talking about young people who are maybe using these tools kind of by force, right? The school chose it for them. So that now means it's up to the school to protect their privacy and their data. And so I always have concerns about what a company is going to do. Now, if we're talking about a new grammar service or something, I don't know how much you're going to be able to do with knowledge of a kid's ability to use a comma, right? That doesn't matter. But when I think about a company positioned like Google, where they have sort of this hold on the market in terms of, the top web browser, the top search engine, they're doing all this advertising. And now you offer this free service in a school where you say, hey, it's free, but we get to see everything that you assigned that kid to read. We get to see their grades on all this stuff. When that kid turns 18 and most of their school experiences through that data, like, tell me you can't turn around and sell them something a little bit better than you would have before. I already know what your interests are. I know what your opinions were, things like that. Now, and you don't have to respond specifically to Google if you don't want, but in terms of how this data can be used or is used, how big of a concern is that, both in the short term just for student safety, but also in the long term in terms of providing people sort of a decent degree of freedom and some integrity and independence in terms of their own beliefs and their experiences? Like, I worry sometimes we're giving away a little too much, particularly when a company offers a quote unquote free solution like that.
Yes. And you're right in many regards. Free is a very generous term to use, because there will always be some kind of intent or value to all stakeholders around that kind of decision. If I come back to your earlier point, and I'm not going to single out in a critical sense in any shape or form, but one of the strands which we've seen over recent years in terms of the online space, particularly with the advent of cloud, has been the move from standalone to building digital ecosystems. And so you can think of the story, and I'll say it in a nice positive way. We used to go and buy books in a bookshop, and then we went online from a very famous brand and bought them there. And as part of a digital ecosystem, what you're trying to do is you're trying to attract people's loyalty, but also make it difficult for them to leave, because you want them to stay with you and generate business. So the best way to make someone stay is that, well, you got your books from there, but now you also get your music from there, and also you do your shopping from there, and you can also get other things. It makes it much harder to walk away to go and take your music with you, but leave your books behind to a different vendor. So the more there's an ecosystem, the more people are locked in. And I think, much as Google and Microsoft have added lots of free and positive resources to the education landscape, in the same way, they are organizations where their revenues ultimately come from In the education space, gas shock surprise, they come from the vendors largely, and the schools paying their subscriptions, because any cloud-based product is generating a lot of income from that for them, for everything that's stored, every transaction that happens, and whatever. So the more vendors that are using those solutions and platforms, the more they're earning indirectly. But of course, they also want the future workforce to spend the next 30 years using that as their platform of choice for the way that they shop, communicate, and engage with their peers and families. So that's part of the long game. And that's in no way a critique, because why wouldn't they? That would make sense. That they're all trying to do that. So I think from that perspective, it kind of follows along as it's kind of the way of the world, really, isn't it? That's the journey that we're seeing there. So that's kind of answering the first point. I'm going to get you just to rephrase the second part of that question, so I don't go off on a tangent for me, if you don't mind.
Well, I mean, yeah, and it's my fault because my question was a little bit of a tangent, but your point about sort of the long-term user makes a lot of sense. And I think that very smartly, that's something that Google has done to try to level the playing field with Microsoft. And it's also something that a lot of students have struggled with, because through, K through 12, they might be using Google, and they go to universities in the United States where nearly all of them still use Microsoft, which I think on average are better and more powerful tools, but they're not always as user-friendly or simple or whatever. So kids they have to make this jump. Well, there might hit a point where you hit this sort of, critical load, you hit this tipping point where maybe they can shift that college market and beyond. But the concern about the data side and the data security is really, I guess, my bigger concern. Your idea about the long-term sort of use of our services is great. And that's just good business sense. But, most learning management systems, but especially the quote unquote free ones, really, have access to a ton of data. And it's, even to the point where when they first started using Google in school systems, not just in mine, in schools in the area, there were a lot of special education teachers that were really uncomfortable. They're putting, confidential information into this cloud server that they really didn't have any control over and anything like this. So we're giving a company an immense amount of private information, whether it's about a student's health situations, their learning abilities and disabilities, to just what books have you read, and think about how many conspiracy theories have been about what if the government tracked your library books? Well, what if a company saw every single thing you did in your school day for 13 years of public school? So in terms of protecting, say, people's privacy and data, what should we be worried about? Is what I just said a reasonable concern, or is that a stretch?
No, I think you'd be anybody who says data privacy isn't a concern is a fool, because even if you can mitigate in every way, it should still continue to be a risk and something that you assess as a risk. Certainly as a standard, what we see in schools is the undertaking of, for any new technology, of what we would refer to this side of the pond as a data protection impact assessment, which really is what data that's unique to the individual is stored, by whom, where is it stored, how long is it stored for, and who has access to it. And if you know those variables, that allows you to define, based on the nature of the data and who has access, where the risk is. And that longevity of storage is also important, because individuals have the right to be forgotten, their data to be removed on request. So I think it starts from a school or a district perspective of being open about the tools that you use, what data you store. Transparency is always the key. I think parents should always know what the backbone of a school's data storage is for student information, should be clear on what information is stored, and alongside that need to be empowered actually about how our young people as digital citizens have the same skills and are taught in terms of how they store their own digital data and where they share that, and so that parents can provide support and guidance. When we move to the conversation about, well, what about the vendors and the risk of they've got the keys to this? I could be flippant because, I'm not always a pro cloud. I'm a bit of it depends when. Cloud works in some cases, but it isn't the panacea to everything. There are some things you do locally in a school where actually going out there serves no logical purpose to me. But we also have to be realistic. The early adopter concepts of, well, the cloud sounds a lot more dangerous. Well, who says that Google's data storage is less secure than the server that you've got hosted locally in your school by somebody who did a part-time qualification on data management? Right. The reality is it isn't a given that if the data's up there, because last time I checked, cloud-based is just a server in another building somewhere else. That's ultimately what it is. It might be spread out a little bit, but so the security is really about the entity and how systems and have their data. Good vendors should provide data maps, so they should be able to say this is the data we have and we store on you, and based on certainly whether you're in AWS or Azure or whatever. If you're a true cloud-based application, then your data should be encrypted. So actually, the processor, the vendor, shouldn't be able to access and read it themselves. So I think it's about having that protection over where the data is, whether it's within your region, are they following your national guidelines, and then having transparency. Because actually the best way to manage data protection risk is to question and challenge about whether you need to put that data there in the first place. And 18 months ago, when we go back to our conversation about we've got to try some new tools, we've got to mitigate this problem for how we're going to engage our learners at home. Well, lots of teachers with best intentions signed up to all sorts of curriculum apps, and some possibly in hindsight would have taken a bit longer to review. What are we putting up there, and do we need to share that information? There is, like it or not, in order to do right by our children for their social emotional needs, and particularly when it comes to special educational needs, we do need that information. That information needs to be somewhere so that the professionals within the school setting can ensure that they're tracking and providing the support and nurture that's needed. So it's really about finding a balance. And I'd argue it's more about recognizing that you do need to keep some data, and where you do, having clarity on where it is, and most importantly of all, who has access to it, that logging and tracking of the access. And then the second bit is it's no reason why you wouldn't keep asking the question, why? Why do you need to store this data there? Why do you need this data about the children? Why do we need to keep this for more than X days or X weeks or X months? So it's good to challenge it and be cynical of it, but I think we've got to also recognise that we're pushing water uphill here. That the world is moving to a point where data is something that everybody shares, sometimes unintentionally, but more often than not, we recognise it is a need in order for us to function and operate. And if I look in a business sense, well, the door's been pushed firmly open, regrettably, or you could argue positively, as a result of COVID, which is remote working. The landscape of using dispersed tools is now far more frequent and common within the business workplace. Well, if you want to remote work and share resources, whether it's your productivity tools, your customer information tools, your financial tools, whatever they are, by the nature of remote working, you need to have access to that data from all different places. So we come back full circle to it's either public cloud or it's private cloud, but it's still a machine somewhere that can be accessed from lots of other places. And so I think rather than sort of looking at it as should we be doing it, I think it's about we've got no choice, but we need to make sure we do it in a controlled, measured and visible way.
Yeah. And again, you came back to sort of that asking that why question, which is, I think, the most important thing. Very interestingly, one of the best pieces of advice that I got probably as a first or second year teacher, it was a specialist. I believe she's a speech pathologist. We went through a very contentious IEP meeting, so individual education plan. And, their parents were very upset, and they were bringing an advocate, and they were considering suing the schools for the student services, all this kind of stuff. I'm a brand new teacher. I'm just sort of along for the ride. And she told me after the meeting, she said, if you keep a personal notebook that you bought with your own money and you take home with you, those are your notes. So if they do a Freedom of Information Act request, she said, your notes are yours, but everything you put on the school computer, every email you send, all the rest of this can go. She goes, so when you need to share data with the other people in the school system, you use all the school's tools and you do it. And when you're just making notes for yourself to remind you or to make a plan, she said, always do that on your own. So that way you haven't put this sort of thing at risk. And I thought, whatever. But a couple of years later, I was in another meeting. I thought that makes a lot of sense. Maybe we sort of take that thinking large scale. We think about the technology we're using, say, district wide, right? Like why do we need to do this? Who needs access to it? And is there a simpler way that it can be done? Just, you're not going to not have problems. You're just going to reduce the number of problems you might potentially run into. And I certainly hope that people are, making good decisions. People who are making more money than I am are hopefully making very good decisions about the tools that we're using, say, at a district level. So we bumped into this earlier. I want to ask you one of the big questions of the podcast here, and we'll get ready to wrap up shortly after this. But we bumped into it when you were talking about both the purpose of school and then your own school, and you mentioned attending boarding schools. And I talked with a guy named Peter Hubble, who's also a CEO, sort of dabbling in education stuff a few episodes ago, and he talked about the benefits of boarding schools. And in emails after the episode, he and one of his assistants were both surprised that I sort of balked at it, but it wasn't. I was like, oh, I think it's great. And then I expressed the concern you had about, the parent's role in the child's life and things like that. But that was a really interesting discussion about what, would be an ideal school. And so I ask every guest, if you could create your own school, and this might be interesting for you because you kind of have, but what would be the ideal school? So imagine for a moment that there are no legal restrictions on what you're doing. As long as students are learning and no one's being hurt, you can do anything you want, right? What would your ideal school be to produce the best outcomes for the young people we're serving?
Goodness, I mean, that's a tough one, isn't it? I'll try and simplify, I suppose, and put a few of the foundations in place. But every classroom is different depending on what works best. So I like the idea that, you walk into a school and you use technology, a nice, fantastic information screens that celebrate student success, not what's on the menu for lunch today. The things that promote positivity and well-being within a school environment. And that you might have rooms that have those experiential VR headsets, lots of augmented reality to engage younger learners and get them visualizing and sensing the things that we want to then use as a catalyst to learn writing and numeracy and other those kind of core building block skills. But at the same time, other spaces where technology just doesn't exist. We use just the power of speech and engagement and that relationship and dynamic between teacher and student. I am absolutely, and it's difficult when we have all through schools. So one school, 4 through 18. So it's quite a broad age range, and there's different focuses and priorities in different areas. I do lean more to the sense that I absolutely support that you can't have experiential activities throughout the day if there's no purpose and there's no outcome to those things. But I think finding a balance, I certainly would like to set the objective that a child leaves having loved education as much as having achieved in education. And I absolutely align more to skills-based, so more free form, certainly for younger learners, learning through play, but developing that the child leads the direction of the things that interest and inspire them to build that kind of love of how they actually acquire and have an interest in education and learning. I am a huge fan of the spoken word. And so I do think there is often not enough time for promoting discussion and breadth of vocabulary and challenge and debate in a healthy, positive sense. So I would absolutely want to support that. It is really difficult beyond that because, I want young people to have the biggest choice. So one of the biggest challenges you have when you're responsible for a school at a strategic level is based on your cohort size. It tends to directly limit the number of choices that you can give young people in terms of the subjects, the pathways. So one thing that we've done between our schools for our older learners is we've got kind of shared sixth formers, our post-16 provision for our learners, so that actually by joining and connecting schools together and resources, you give a greater breadth of resource and choices for young people. So I suppose the thing that I would want to do as a school is to break down some of the typical structures of a school and actually have clusters of schools working cohesively so that learners can have a much bigger choice. Because I don't want people taking qualifications because it makes us just appear well on league tables. I mean, league tables is nice, thank you very much. But actually, we want our children to choose subjects that they're most likely to be successful in and actually achieve something from. So here in the UK, we have a kind of an overall encompassing qualification, which is referred to as an EBAC, but basically shows that you've got your maths, English, and some sciences, but you've got a foreign language. For some learners, that just isn't something they're going to be successful at. But in making them choose that pathway, they potentially don't take a subject where they could have excelled and done well. So I would like much more to be judging young people in the round, not based on some kind of weighting. Obviously, we know literacy unlocks maths once we get past the early stages in terms of problem solving and understanding, but really about breadth. And that really flies into the same way with schools. We've already got that thing I referred to about schools being good at sharing, but I think also the natural pressure of league tables and who's the highest performing school in the region and so on. I'd like to see that removed so that actually schools work collaboratively in clusters, so that there wasn't that. There was much more openness about sharing, whether it's work schemes, resources, collaboration, best practice of teachers being able to provide those kind of insets and support for staff across clusters of schools. And actually, in part in our city, we've started doing that with a CEOs group and a chairs group and actually getting staff from different, subject areas of humanities, maths and so on, actually collectively working together. So I think in a rather woolly way, I've said I want a school that's not got any, it's got physical walls, but hasn't actually got any operational walls. It's connected with other schools so that children get the best choices of different subjects they want. There's better collaboration between staff. That actually we put a focus and emphasis on children actually having a love of learning by giving them more experiences and more engagement in the things that really stimulate them early on, that will carry them through to be more inquisitive and embrace it in later life. And tech has a place to play, but shouldn't be seen as a measure of success. If you've got more tech, it doesn't make you better.
Yeah, and sometimes I feel like we have to be reminded of that, that I've been using this metaphor a lot lately that, if you look at a carpenter, someone building a house, you don't judge them by how many tools they use to build it. You judge them, did they build a good house? And that carpenter should choose the best tools for the job, not just the new tool because it's shiny, and so we have to sort of focus on that. This is sort of an accidental theme in this podcast, but interdisciplinary stuff comes up a lot for whatever, I guess just because a lot of people are interested in it. In talking about breaking down some of those walls between schools and how we share information, and you even mentioned having teachers from different curricular areas working together. Do you think, sort of at the big picture level, I know it's hard to implement, but do you think that hanging on to the traditional disciplines is slowing down the kind of innovation you just described? Like the idea, I'm an English teacher, and he's a science teacher. And do you think that maintaining those disciplines is something that is productive, or is that a hindrance to the kind of collaboration and innovation that you're suggesting?
I think that's a really interesting one. I mean, I think that there's different arguments that could probably be stacked either side of that topic. I think clearly there's no denying that teachers have specialist skills and knowledge on their particular area of their content knowledge. That means that they're best placed to deliver the core on certain subjects. I think where it gets kind of grayer for me is that being an English teacher, yes, you may have that great content knowledge to talk about the works of Shakespeare or whoever it may be as part of your delivery of your course. But actually language infuses across all subjects. Acquisition, the spoken word, the challenge, the debate, those same values and experiences you've got mean that I think it absolutely shouldn't be a case of that's what you teach, and that actually you could equally spark debate and discussion that would be just as relevant in a history setting and talking about the why we did things and what were they thinking and what were the drivers for that, and the experiential side of trying to set the narrative behind those things. And we often talk about in our schools where youngsters do well at maths, but suddenly reach a point at 6 or 7 years, often 7 to 8, where suddenly the numbers are not the sole part of the skill set, and we go from adding or subtracting or multiplying, but we start problem making, and then suddenly the language becomes the barrier for the child to actually use their mathematical skills. So I think there are always places where we've seen it, certainly in the UK model, is that we refer, and it's basically the K through 12 broken in half really. We have our primary schools up to the age of 11, and then we have secondary schools for 12 or so onwards. And in the primary setting, teachers teach all of the subjects, and in the secondary phase, teachers are specialists. Where we've seen is there's an opportunity both ways for specialist teachers to get engaged in early years teaching and actually provide resources and experience that some of our primary teachers wouldn't have the experience or exposure to. So we can kind of bring science experiments and language skills down into the primary classroom. But equally on the other side, moving to our secondary phase, we see that when a child moves into the next stage of their education journey, not every child's ready for that journey at the same time. Childs develop at different rates and have different confidence levels. So we often find that actually bringing some of those primary teachers into the secondary phase to provide that social emotional nurture support allows us to make sure a child has a slow introduction into the next phase of their education journey and gets the right kind of support to flourish. And I think you bring the strengths from every discipline. And what I like to see is where you see departments looking at the strengths of different teachers or their experiences. And it is all about the teacher, the human being, the person. What are your strengths? What are the things that you're passionate about? And being able to share. The only problem I really have with the model is that certainly based on most schools and capacity and resources, the timetabling doesn't often allow much for fluidity or sharing of resources other than extracurricular activities, those kind of after school clubs.
Right.
So often that's the domain where we see teachers crossing boundaries and getting involved together and working together collaboratively on some of the great additional resources and activities that kids get involved in.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and it's like, how could you do that? I always loved biology as a student, and then I took a ton of anthropology classes in college and all that. And like, I would love the opportunity to teach an English class that was mostly biology. Like everything we read, we could do it, but I would need a bio teacher to step in, once every 2 weeks to clean up some of the details that I don't remember, or I don't have the time to relearn, to reteach, and all that. I don't know. I think that's a great way to sort of use the tools available to us and to let students really work independently and find their interests, is to tear down some of those walls that are in between the subjects. But it's not.
But you've got the opportunity, Ryan. I apologize to talk across you. I was going to say, you might have that opportunity in your next role, because I think when we think about what we've learned with our online provision of blended learning is that we can be delivering content to a cohort, but we can be a mixture of synchronous from a subject lead and asynchronous exemplars from other teachers within the campus that can provide that mix.
I'm really excited about it. I mean, it looks like, at least for the first year, we're going to have small class sizes and all this kind of stuff. But we're sort of building the plane, in midair, and so I don't know exactly what's going to be allowed or promoted. But I have a whole notebook full of fun ideas, and I'm just waiting to see what's going to work. So all right, well, we're getting ready to wrap this up. It was a great conversation, but we all do have other things to do here. I have two final things. One is open mic. So anything that you want to hit on that we haven't done yet. And then I always end these discussions with just a couple quick recommendations of books and movies that we want people to check out. Obviously, one of them is my secret Edtech diary. But is there anything in this discussion that you would like to clarify, add on, or maybe something we missed that you'd like to talk about? The mic is yours for a moment if you like.
Thank you. I suppose the one thing is probably coming full circle back to the beginning. One of the sentiments for the book, but also I think for this conversation, is just to reiterate, I think the thing that we can do most, or I hope we can embrace most, is that EdTech is not the realm of the techies. When we talk about the role of technology in education, it's everybody's business. It affects everybody within the education space. And what we need to do is empower people to be able to ask the right questions and challenge and share the views, the pressures and the aspirations that they have. And I really want to break down this idea that EdTech is somehow a techie topic. It really shouldn't be. It really isn't. And we don't, I always think this kind of irony of, we trust all of our teachers in the classroom with their cohort of children to do the very best by them throughout the year. Suddenly we flip online and suddenly it's like, we need to tell you exactly what to do. Really? No, you don't. Follow the same path. The tech is just one small part of the equation, and it's a facilitator to doing what everybody already knows how to do.
Yeah. That's it is kind of funny the way the dynamic of that conversation changed when all of a sudden everybody's working remotely, and not like my principal pops into my room often anyway, but when he doesn't have the ability to pop in physically, all of a sudden everybody gets nervous about different things. No, and using my carpenter metaphor or analogy there, if you can build a house, you should never be intimidated by a new tool. The trick is figure out, can it help you to build a house better, to build a better house? And so when I hear people who are resistant to new options, I think, you should at least learn about the tool. And sometimes when someone's too eager for the tool, I'm like, slow down and remember what you're really here to do. So in addition to your book, and of course you can list that and, mention it, but any other book or movie recommendations, and this can be education related or just for fun. I get all kinds of weird stuff here from people. So this can be a personality piece or it can be technical information. What are a few books or movies you think that listeners would appreciate?
Well, it might be a shock to you. I'm not that big a movie viewer because time is a commodity, much like for everybody else, that's not on my radar very often. So more often will find me dipped into paper than I will to digital. But thinking about books that kind of stand out, I'm wanting to just recognize that actually there's all different types of things that we can engage in. One book that I've enjoyed, actually I find it quite relaxing and a great way to distill ideas and communicate. Many in the education space will have come across Sylvia Duckworth and her doodles and designs. Sylvia Duckworth has a great book called How to Sketchnote, step-by-step manual for teachers and students. And it's all really, whether we want to call it along the lines of when we dual code information, but just how we can communicate information visually. And I really like that because I, like many people, find doodling when I'm having a conversation or a thing is a great way of just shaping and informing and making notes. But visually, actually, it's a more accessible way. It's a bit of a left field for the conversation we've had today because no text involved whatsoever. But I just thought I would share it because I think it's a really useful one for teachers and to think about different ways. I'd certainly encourage you to check out Sylvia Duckworth's work because she does some fantastic diagrams that showcase lots of things that we will all resonate with, but really are great little guides to have and reminds yourself of to pin on the wall. Again, this one other book I would like to mention. It is more UK sourced, but it actually the rules and the content applies around the world. It's a relatively new book. It's called Lessons Will Be Learned, and it is a book that reflects on the learning journey in terms of delivering online safety and in-school safety for our children. And given the increased use of technology, I mean, the book is about the broader sense of safeguarding our children in school and recognizing how we need to support and nurture, recognizing the signs and how we track concerns. But I'm a big fan of digital citizenship, which is the proactive way of making sure our young people can be kept safe online and know how to keep themselves safe online. But we also need to balance that with making sure that we've got the right professional development and tools in place within our schools to make sure we can do everything we can to keep our children safe online. So it's a really good read, written by former police officers now in the education space, but Lessons Will Be Learned is another good one I'd recommend.
Nice.
There's a couple of takeaways for you.
Yeah, that's really good. And I'm sure that one's actually probably, something that people probably need to be reading, thinking very carefully about the changes that we've seen. And as we, wait and see what changes are going to stick around, right? We've done a lot of things differently for the last 2 years or so. It'll be interesting to see how many of those stick and what do we figure out how to do well sort of at scale. By the way, just a quick note with the Sylvia Duckworth book, the How to Sketchnote, you say there's no technology. I remind my students all the time that technology is every tool you use. It's not just the new stuff, and so I tell them, I say, it's great that we have all these great resources and the internet is wonderful. But remember, I could teach you everything you really need here, at least skills wise, using a Sunday newspaper and paper and a pencil. And they're like, well, there's no technology. I'm like, all of that's technology. It's just old. So you don't appreciate it anymore. I always tell them Socrates hated the written word because he thought if you wrote things down, you wouldn't have to pay attention to conversations and you wouldn't have to remember anything. And how silly does it sound now to, one of the great philosophers said, don't write anything down. So every time I'm in a meeting and a teacher says, oh, we don't need this app or whatever, I'm like, all right, Socrates, take it easy, So yeah, the sketchnoting would be great,
You make a good point, Ryan. You do make a good point on that. And on the broader sense of the lessons will be learned and the safeguarding thing, as a vendor, it's something that we offer solutions for the online safety and obviously thinking when it comes to Child Internet Protection Act and other broader things. But I think this is much more about empowering skills-based conversation again, young people to know what they're doing, but also just to question and challenge the validity of information that they see. And now more than ever, frankly, there is just so much that we really present more challenge to young people than we ever had when we were children in terms of having to not be able to take information for what it's written, but actually to have to look behind it.
To have to be constantly evaluating. Yeah. All right. Well, we're gonna wrap this thing up. Al, I appreciate you taking the time to talk. This has been great. And there's, as you point out, a lot we probably could have dug into more. But we've been talking with Al Kingsley, the author of My Secret EdTech Diary, also the CEO of NetSupport Group. Al, if people are interested in finding out more or maybe reaching out to you with a question, is there any place, social media, website, things like that, place where people could contact you or learn a little bit more?
Absolutely. Twitter is always a good starting point. Al Kingsley _edu. You can find me on Twitter. You can also find me on my personal website, alkingsley.com, or head across to netsupport-inc.com.
All right. Well, that is perfect. Thank you very much, Al, for taking the time to talk today. This has been the ClassCast Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens. You can find the ClassCast Podcast on all major streaming services, on YouTube, and at classcastpodcast.com. Thank you very much and have a great day.